everybody, the Honda back catalogue of the last 30 years is filled with some incredible machinery, from the mighty NSX to the humble CRX, the Civic, the Integra and the Accord. It seems at some point in time Honda has made a car for just about everybody, and still there are plenty of Hondas out there that I think don't often get the recognition they deserve, and this is one of those. Today I am driving a third generation Honda Prelude. Is it Prelude or is it Prelude? I think it's Prelude. I'm going to stick with Prelude, and then at least if I've got it wrong, I'm going to get it consistently wrong through the rest of the video. Either way, the Prelude is an example of a car that we used to see a lot of, but today rarely do. The upmarket, luxurious, two-door sporty coupe. This car is made in the same mold as things like the Toyota Sora, the Nissan 300ZX. Incidentally, I've never driven a 300ZX, so if you happen to have one that I can drive, please do get in touch. And if you have some interesting Hondas too, or in fact anything interesting, please do drop me a line, because I want to broaden my horizons as much as I can. These I've always known about, but not really known all that well. As it happens, the one thing I thought I knew about the Prelude is probably the same thing that you know about it, which is it was the first car to have four-wheel steering. But it turns out that isn't strictly true. It was the first car, I believe, sold in America that had four-wheel steer as an option, but was not the first car made with it. Nissan beat them to the punch with the R31 Skyline. However, I think it's not unfair to say that Honda probably were the company who got it right the first. Even amongst Skyline aficionados, the early Nissan HiCas system, which is their name for the technology, isn't particularly well received. Many GTR owners I know either remove or disable the HiCas system on their cars, and a few of them too have credited it with being the cause of a crash. The system here is entirely mechanical, and it doesn't function how you might expect it to. It's essentially tied in with the steering rack, so at lower steering angles the rear wheels will move in phase with the front, up to about 1.5 degrees. But for turning maneuvers, when you've got a lot of lock, they will then move against you, up to just over 5 degrees, which is a lot. And handily, we're just about to come up to a section where I will need to turn the car around, so we should be able to see the system in action. I have naturally placed a camera so you'll be able to see what's going on, and this is my patent-pending 3-point turn hill start torture test, which I'm not going to do as I usually would. Indicator is on the JayEmm side, although this is not a Japanese import, it's a UK market car. Right, this is a really tight turn. I would normally not be able to make in anything. Wow, this car really can turn on a sixpence. I'm at full steering lock now. That's unbelievable. That's like London taxi type turning circle. Wow. This third generation of Prelude was produced from 1987 until 1991, with the first model years officially being a 1988. This is a 1988 built example, has spent quite a bit of its time in Northern Ireland, but is a UK car. And before I tell you a little bit more about it, let's have some fun in it. You certainly can have. We'll get onto the steering in a moment, but I will discuss one thing that this car does not have. It being a Honda, you probably expect that engine up front to be wearing the VTEC badge, but alas, it does not, because this car actually predates VTEC on cars, which debuted not that long after. The NSX was one of the first applications of the technology, and I believe the Integra also got it at more or less the same time. However, this, a B20A, does not have it. More or less all of the engines available in the 3rd generation Prelude were a 2-litre B20 lump. The lower powered versions were a 12-valve layout with single overhead cam and carburetors. This is one of the spicy ones, a 16-valve lump with dual overhead cams and programmed fuel injection. It makes 150 horsepower and revs to a very modest 6.5. An automatic gearbox was available, and indeed Adrian, this car's owner, has one of those. But this is the one he really wanted, with the 5-speed manual, and it is a delightful gearbox. In fact, the whole powertrain is sensational. Massively pokey, it is not, but it makes a pretty good noise, breathing now through a fully custom exhaust. The gear change is sweet, power is smooth, predictable, linear, perhaps to a fault, but very, very enjoyable. The view out of this car is also absolutely incredible. In one of his opening emails, Adrian drew comparisons between this and the NSX, which I thought was a fairly bold thing to do. However, sat now in the car, I don't think he was actually joking all that much. The rear light setup does look very NSX, but more impressively than that, sat in here now, I do get very NSX-y vibes. It's not the same sort of swooping dash layout as you get in the mid-engine car, but you've got the feeling of that front being impossibly low. It's amazing. The shape of it I love too. There's a lot of definition to it. 2 really pronounced haunches in the corner. It's magnificent. It's amazing to think there's even an engine up there, but there really is. It's been canted over by 18 degrees to help lower the bonnet line compared with the outgoing car, and it really works. I will confess, one of the reasons that I haven't owned that many Hondas in the past is because the vast majority of them drive the front wheels. And that's just not something the petrol head in me has often been able to accept. In a hatchback, in a Civic, fine, makes total and complete sense. But in a car like this, in a coupe, I just expect it to be driving the rears. However, in the Prelude's defense, the front works really well. The fact you've got front-wheel drive also means that at the back you have a pretty generously sized boot. The car is not that small, it's narrow, it looks diminutive, it doesn't take up much volume, but there's more of it than you'd expect. It's 4.7 meters long, which is pretty big. That's knocking on the door of a modern 4 Series. The seating is more of the 2+2 rather than 4-seater variety, but there is room in the back. It's not impossible to get adults in there. Adrian has always had a bit of a thing for the Prelude. He had one just like this as a young man about 30 years ago, when a couple of years ago, like many of us, Adrian found himself with a lot of time on his hands. He decided that would be the perfect opportunity to get himself into another Prelude. The first one he purchased was a limited edition, the automatic that I referenced earlier, but he always wanted a white manual car like the one he'd owned as a young man. This, unsurprisingly, was in the care of another young man over in Northern Ireland. He had made a few modifications, fitted the lower BC coilovers, put this Momo steering wheel on it. The car was always white, but from factory it was in a shade called Polar White. The man in Ireland had resprayed this in Honda's Championship White, which is a very desirable and well-known colour, but not technically correct for the car. What Adrian decided to do was respray it again, also in white, and in neither Polar or Championship. Instead, this is a colour called Frost, and he did that because it's the colour his 3rd generation Prelude was. Technically speaking, I don't believe that colour was available for this model year, but it's close enough. I think we can let him have that one. It was a white Prelude, it is still a white Prelude, it is in the colour available for a Prelude of more or less the time, so that, to me, I don't really see as anything bad. He put the OZ wheels on. They actually suit it quite well. I know to some they'll look a little bit too scene kid, but I rather like them. By going from the original 14-inch up to a 16, he also has a much better selection of tyres, and this car is now wearing marginally wider ones than factory, 205 versus 195. He also fitted this exhaust, which I'm told is far more sensible than the one it previously had, because that was straight through. As it is, I think this car is probably just a little bit too noisy for the amount of power that it makes, but it's not antisocial. You can tolerate it. It's a little bit boomy in here, but nothing horrendous. He has already had the exhaust wrapped in places to minimize the boom, but for a car like this, honestly, I'm really not worried about it. Anyway, I've prattled on for more than long enough about other stuff that's not particularly relevant. Now let's talk about the big deal with the Prelude, the steering. As Mr. Spock might say, the steering is fascinating. I genuinely don't know whether I love it or hate it. It's very light at nearly all times. It is power assisted, but genuinely doesn't actually feel it. You get a lot of texture and feedback coming through the wheel, which often in Hondas you do not. Steering, generally a weak point with them. But this, rather beautiful. You really get a sense of the texture of the road. It also moves in the hand quite freely, feels genuinely alive, but and I really don't quite understand what's going on here. You do a lot with your hand. You've probably seen me doing a lot of sort of that kind of stuff through the video, but it doesn't seem like you're actually achieving all that much. It seems like you're doing lots and lots and lots and lots and lots, but the car isn't really responding to it all that much. Feels almost a little bit like being in a boat, because you can do almost whatever you want with this wheel, it feels, and the car doesn't seem that keen to react. The Momo wheel does look a little bit out of place in an otherwise standard interior. The velour seats in particular, I kinda love. Honestly, these seats, I just put my hand on them and I was suddenly 7 years old again, sat on my nan and granddad's brown settee, trying to wrestle for dear life not to be sort of dragged into the thing. They hug your side a lot more than you might expect, and they are overall great chairs. Back to this steering though. See, I'm in a bend and I feel like I'm turning the wheel a lot, and I feel like the wheels are moving. I feel like they are responding, but the car just doesn't. Look, I could do a lot and the car does not. Going down here, this wheel is moving so much, and yet the car is kind of resisting it. I don't know whether it's the rear wheel steer contributing to this. It must be in some way, shape or form. Presumably because it's turning with you at smaller steering inputs, the whole car it's almost crabbing from one side of the road to the other, hence the odd sensation. Still turns in great though. Grip levels are decent, but I have on more than one occasion, particularly when the road surfaces become very, very tricky, felt the back end just feeling like it wants to break away, just giving out a little hint that it's there, that it's alive, that it's not simply a passenger. Oh, that's just magic though, to do that, drop into these bends. I'm doing like 50 miles an hour and I feel like a hero. It's not quick, it's really not quick, but I also don't care. It's just a magic Honda. Oh, love it. This gearbox is also a real joy to use, though it doesn't look particularly fancy, and let's be honest here, none of the interior does. These chrome door handles look very out of place. I think that's Honda's attempt to try and make it more upmarket, but the action here is absolutely perfect. It's a little lighter than you might expect, but it does exactly what you tell it to, when you tell it to, and combine it with an engine that is so keen to rev up, you find yourself changing gear at every opportunity. Any car with a sunroof also gets bonus points, and this one is super cool because it appears to have a sort of sunset tint to it, so everything I see through it looks like a Tony Scott movie. The Prelude in general, though it's existed in 5 generations, you just don't tend to see around anymore. I actually spotted a later 5th gen car the other day when I was just out and about, and I think that's the first time I've seen one in the wild for a very long time. As it happens, I did bump into a couple of people with 5th gen Preludes at Japfest a little while back, so I need to get back in touch with them and hopefully organise a review of one of those, because they are also a very different car. Those still have the all-wheel steer system, but it was electronic rather than mechanical as it is here. The 5th generation car also got the Prelude Type S. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, Honda simply never made a Type R. I think that's probably one reason the Prelude is often overlooked today. These are quite light, they weigh around 1175 kilos. Because they are a pretty good size, you can use them as a daily if you want to. This one has a Blaupunkt Bremen in it, which is a really cool system that I quite like. It looks like a 1980s stereo, but actually has Bluetooth, DAB, modern functionality, all that sort of stuff. They're not cheap and they're very hard to get in the UK, but well worth tracking down. They're cool systems. And if you want to pick one of these up now, you'd be looking at spending anywhere between £5,000 to £10,000. This one, I am told, is probably one of the best in the country, but even so, on a good day, it's likely to fetch around 15 grand, which isn't actually what it owes Adrian, because he has spent a lot on this car. Unsurprisingly, despite these being, when new, a relatively expensive car, for a long time they were quite cheap. Because of that, you'll see a lot of poorly maintained, badly modified examples out there that you probably want to steer clear of. As with many a Japanese car, the #1 killer of the Prelude is rust. You really can feel when that rear steer starts to turn against you. It's quite incredible. I do, however, feel like it's almost wasted. It feels like a little bit of a gimmick because it's only really of use to me in extraordinarily tight turns when you're not doing much speed and car parks. That's about it. In the 80s and 90s, four-wheel steer became one of those buzz phrases people used to try and sell a car, much like injection before it, or turbo. I am very pleased to say the BC coilovers have not ruined this car's ride. Just in case you thought they were fitted simply for scene points, and they have lowered the car quite a bit, it turns out that original springs, at least front or rear, we can't remember which, are now unobtainium. By the time the 5th and final generation Prelude went off sale in the early 2000s, all-wheel steer had more or less become a distant memory. A recession in Japan had meant they simply didn't have the money to keep throwing at these technological solutions, and the market, I think, never really understood them. Sources argue as to exactly how popular the four-wheel steer was, with some saying American buyers simply didn't want it, and others saying about 80% of people actually did buy it. If anyone can clarify that, I would be very grateful. Today, the technology is seeing a real renaissance. Because cars have gotten larger and heavier than ever before, it's a great way to make even a pretty big heifer of a thing feel relatively agile. And I have to say, it really does work. Modern electronics also mean it works much more reliably than it ever did too. But I am very glad to say that the 3rd generation Honda Prelude is much more than simply some gimmicky steering. It's a great car. Thanks to Adrian for bringing it out. A big thanks to you as ever for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.